Well, good evening and welcome to Present Edge. This is Gary McBride. I'll be your host for the next 2 hours or so. And this evening, a special guest in the studio. I've got the leader and founder of the conduction group entitled The Flux Crew, a fellow by the name of Dino J.A. Deane. So as we're getting ourselves situated here in the studio, I thought I would play a selection of conduction music. This was recorded back in 2003, recorded live at the 47th Venice Biennale. It's called SHENG number 6.
We got together for about 2 weeks before the Biennale, and we did some sessions where Butch was teaching, because a lot of the players had played with Butch before, but a lot of them hadn't, and so they were learning the vocabulary. And conduction is basically a gesture-based way of working with large ensembles to create collective composition.
So when you perform as a conduction group, do you have anything pre-planned?
Nothing is pre-planned. There's no written music. It's all based on hand gestures. And so the process of learning it is you start to understand what the possibilities are. But as you'll hear tonight in the examples that we play, that the music is really different with every ensemble. Within the same ensemble, it's different every time you play. And depending on the instruments and the backgrounds of the musicians, you come up with very, very different types of music. So it's really quite a non-genre specific way of working. And that was one of the things that Butch always worked towards, is not limiting what he was doing to any stylistic category.
And the music that you've brought with you this evening, I think, really exemplifies that. We have 7 pieces of music, and they're all very, very, very different. Did you want to talk any more about SHENG number 6 before we listen to our next selection?
I mean, it was really a fascinating project. He had gotten commissioned to do the closing concert at I think it was the 47th Venice Biennale. And so he decided to put together this, not a world music ensemble, but a world instrument ensemble doing conduction. And like I said, we worked for about 2 weeks. And the second week we did 3 nights at the Bowery Poetry Club in Manhattan, which was this tiny little club, tiny little stage. And there's some wonderful recordings from that have not been published yet. I've been working with Alexander, Butch's son, who is executor of his estate now, and Alexander is working on releasing a lot of amazing music that has yet to see the light of day.
ThinMan by Tube 60. My guest, Deane, played trombone and bass flute. Ralph Carney played trombone and contrabass clarinet. Now that's an interesting doubling. Nick Phelps played the English and French horns, which, again, that's an odd combination of doubling there. Yeah, Andrew Voigt was on soprano sax and soprano flute, different instruments, but not out of the realm. Beth Custer on alto and bass clarinets, slacker, and Steve Deutsch on bass flute and bass clarinet. I'm speaking with Dino J.A. Deane. Dino, tell us about that piece that we just heard.
Well, I had been playing with Butch now for about 10 years, and I was really enjoying being a musician doing conduction. I was really taken by what could happen in the conduction vocabulary. But I wanted to see if it was possible to do conduction without a conductor. So I put this sextet together with these amazing improvisers who doubled on really odd combinations. I mean, Ralph Carney, the late Ralph Carney, who is such an amazing musician, playing trombone and contrabass clarinet. Nick Phelps, English horn and French horn. You can't think of two more different instruments. Yeah. And a lot of so I kind of taught them the vocabulary of conduction, what the signs were, what they meant. But I was trying to figure out a way that I could play in the ensemble too. And so I came up with these different kind of graphic scores. One was called three-hand. Another thing that I was noticing that in free improvisation, the tendency is to play kind of really long arcs that last 20 minutes or 30 minutes. If you're playing with really good improvisers, there might be a number of short arcs within that, but very rarely will a free improvisation stop. And so I wanted to find a way that could kind of help us practice playing with shorter time frames, improvising in shorter time frames. So I came up with this graphic score called Three-Hand, and within a sextet, there are 20 trio combinations. Mm-hmm. So I made this deck of 20 cards that each card had the one of the trios, which could be number 2, number 4, number 6. The next one might be number 1, number 3, number 6.
And I see that you've got a grid there. You're looking at a piece of paper with a grid on it.
Yeah. So what you would
right?
you would do is you'd organize the 20 cards, and then you'd write out, and each musician had a number, and so you would write out like, the first trio is 2, 4, 6. The next trio is 1, 3, 6. So player number 6 continues through. And the way it ends up is each musician plays in 10 of the trios, but how many trios a person plays through depends on kind of shuffling the deck or the way you've arranged it. So you can come up with, I think it's thousands of variations of this. And then the other thing that we would do is we would set a time frame. So we were going to go through 20 trios in, say, 10 minutes. So that would mean that each trio was approximately 30 seconds long. So how do you compose something improvising and thinking in terms of ensemble playing, not soloing, but thinking in terms of creating ensemble music in these shorter time frames? It was really a fascinating period of time. That band was together for, I think, about 2 years, and got quite good at just moving. And the other thing would happen is, because everybody doubled, every time you entered, you could play a new instrument. So the orchestration of the ensemble was constantly shifting, but everything was improvised.
It's fascinating. And so thanks for bringing along that excerpt from one of the pieces.
I started actually conducting. I picked up the baton in 97. And my very first conduction was I did in San Francisco, and I wanted to employ an actor in the ensemble too, because I have a long history of working in theater. And so this next cut is actually from the very, very first Conduction I did.
Well, let's listen to that. This is Dino J.A. Deane conducting and live sampling, a recording from 1997. The piece is entitled The Past Deleted.
Country sound to it. Jermaine said, I like that. Rain. And nobody else ain't nothing. Rhonda get up after Miss Rain gone. Rhonda something. Okay. Look at the alphabets. She said loud. I'm gonna say, you ain't gonna talk so loud. But I don't. Okay. She say, which name go first? Consuelo say, I guess that's me. I don't wanna know, but I don't ask. I say Rhonda something else of a lady. Without me asking, she's saying, you get it, princess? I says, no. She said, look at the alphabets. Anybody name here start with an A? I shake my head. B. I shake my head. C. Don't shake my head. Good, she said. She said, Consuelo start with a C. She first. She write, number 1, Consuelo. Who next? She asked me, I don't know. She pointed to a D, E, F, G. I look Jermaine. Jermaine said, my name starts with a J. Rhonda go H, I, J. I point Jermaine. Now it's number 1, Consuelo. Number 2, Jermaine. Why, sure. Anita, as soon as you're finished, we'll stop off at some restaurant and get me some breakfast. Man, you sure start playing the dozens early in the a.m. Only kidding, baby. I said, knock yourself out. Thank you, kindly, sir. You get it. I say Rhonda something else. Without me asking, she's saying, oh, please. I said Miss Joke. I say Ron. Okay. I say Ron. Like, she never loved me. I swear to you, nothing ever happened. I bought her gifts, whatever. Sunglasses like mine, patchouli scented lotion, incense, a tiny gold little thing from Jerusalem to keep away the evil eye or whatever. We went to the movies, that documentary thing about Klaus Barbie. Boring. Fell asleep on her lap. She lightly rubbed my head like someone trying to get a genie out of me or something. I sat in her living room, smelled like gardenias floating in big glass balls. There were fresh flowers everywhere. I remember waiting with her, those flowers all around me. She wore cut-off jeans, men's suit, things that showed her breasts. We ate in restaurants, Caesar salads, French fries, pasta. She adored me in public more than anywhere else. Or maybe someone would overhear our conversation and imagine something really going on between us. I listened to her stories, dusted off, the past deleted. She hears that. Now that's a good one. I'm telling you that. And she's maybe like 3. She stayed with my mother for a while, my old room, my old bed, my old Star Wars sheet. And she's almost asleep. And I'm trying to remember how the story goes exactly. And I can't. All I can remember is it's about a beautiful princess. And she's married to this real brick of a king. And this king, he's going to kill her unless she can keep his gifts. So she's telling this story that goes on and on and on, like 1,000 twists and turns. She's making it up as she goes, see, and so she's all like, what happens next? Scheherazade, and she's all like, and then and then, like that, forever. And then she's all like, and then, like that, forever. And then she's all like, what happens next? And she's all like, and then, 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 like that forever.
That was a piece called The Past Deleted. You're listening to Present Edge on KGNU. Gary McBride here. My guest this evening with me in the studio is Dino J.A. Deane. And I'd like to back announce that last piece that we just heard because it's the beginning, I think, of a 15-year journey for for my guest. So that was, you heard the voice of an actor from San Francisco named Sean San Jose Blackman. And I'm going to ask Dino a little bit about what he was using as his text, because it sounded to me like poetry. Dino himself was conducting that and also doing live sampling, which he'll talk about in a little bit. Two bass players. We had Neil Kaku and Damon Smith, and then two drummers, excellent drummers, Joseph Sabella and Deb Craig. And then Miguel Frasconi was also sampling, but not live sampling. And then Terry Roleri was on electric guitar. So, Dino, could you tell us about the origin of that piece, the text, and a little bit about Out of Context?
Okay. Well, I had moved to New Mexico in 96, I believe. And in 97, I decided that I would even better understand conduction if I did a little conducting myself and kind of understood the vocabulary from the other side of the baton.
So that was the first time you'd done that.
And I put together two projects that were just going to be one-offs. One was in San Francisco and one was in New Mexico. And the one in New Mexico was musicians that I had just met, and the one in San Francisco was musicians that I knew very well because I had lived there for a long time. And the one in New Mexico and the one in San Francisco happened first, and then I did one in New Mexico. And it was a similar thing in New Mexico. It was a different ensemble, but I also used an actor. And I have a long history of doing sound design for dramatic theater. And one of the things I noticed was when you would get to the point in the production where you would do it what was called a cue to cue, and the actors would have to keep repeating things because they were dialing in the lights and checking things. As the actors got bored with having to repeat the same thing, they would start not necessarily improvising, but they would start embellishing their characters. And I thought, wow, this is some amazing theater that you don't get to see once the piece is locked in. And there's a real non-linear component in conduction in that the music can go anywhere at any point in time. And so I wanted to see what would happen if I put an actor in that situation. And so with Sean in San Francisco, and I had worked with him a lot in different productions, I said, I want you to come with as much text as you want, you know, but I don't want you to stay on any text too long. And I want you to come with a bunch of different characters and have each of the characters know the text. So if two characters said the same text, it would be different because of the backstory of each of those characters.
So you were giving him like some layering cues so he could sort of improvise, even though the text itself had already been sort of through composed.
Yes. And I also encouraged them. The other thing that happens with, the reality of text, just like the reality of notated music, is it's very linear. It becomes very linear. And so I was suggesting, you don't have to start at the beginning of a sentence. You don't have to complete a sentence. And so Sean approached it in a certain way. And when I did the second project in New Mexico, I used an actor who I had just worked with on one piece, and his name was Rod Harrison. And he did a really interesting thing. He took all this text and he cut it up, and then he pasted it onto a deck of playing cards. And he sat on the stage with a table. He came in a bathrobe and pajamas, and it was like he was in his apartment. And we had a mic in front of him at the table, and he was playing solitaire. And so every time he turned up a card, he would be presented with a new text, and he would jump to that text wherever it was. And then he also had a range of characters. And so it was a really fascinating adventure, and I did these 2 one-off projects, and then I was going to say, okay, now I've gotten a little taste of conducting, and I was going to kind of sit back and reflect on that. And the musicians in the New Mexico ensemble said they wanted to continue doing this. So the thing about New Mexico is everything is very far apart. So I had some musicians from Santa Fe, some from Albuquerque, and I lived way in the boonies. So we decided we would get together once a month just to do conduction. And that ensemble lasted for 15 years. And when I finally stopped that ensemble, there were, maybe 7 people in the band who had been in the band for 14 years. And we're going to play a cut from that. This was one of the musicians, one of the vocalists in Out of Context, who came in the band. In the end, he was in the band for about 10 years. And his name is John Flax, and he runs a theater company called Theater Grotesco. And he really developed the ability to work with text in quite an amazing way. And this piece, it has no text in it, and it was actually a piece we did for one of Theater Grotesco's plays called We Know Madmen. And this is a piece called Dark Passage, which we're going to play now.
That was a piece entitled Dark Passage. It was actually incidental music from the 2006 play We Know Madmen. As I said, Dino J.A. Deane was the conductor. Cornet was John Baldwin. C.K. Barlow did live sampling. Matt Deason on electric bass. Katie Harlow on cello. Joseph Sabella on vibes. Carlos Santisteban on acoustic bass. Bonnie Schmader on alto flute. Alicia Ultan on viola, and Jefferson Voorhees drums percussion. And we heard on the melody for at least half of that excerpt the amazing bassoonist Sam Rhodes. And Dino and I were talking while the music was going a little bit about the amazing classical musician that turned into a real advocate of the conduction technique.
Yeah, it's interesting. When Butch developed conduction, it was really incubated more in the jazz community and really the free jazz community, the improvising community. And the thing about conduction that's I find fascinating is it's not about soloing. It really is about ensemble music, creating ensemble music. And sometimes you run into players that are really incredible players, but they are quite wrapped up in their egos. And in the first 10 years working with Butch, I would witness free players really push back. And you'd hear statements like, I'm an improviser, man, and you're telling me what to play. Which is hardly the case. Basically, you're given each of the gestures, each of the signs is a parameter that you're asked to deal with. But what you do with that parameter is completely up to you. So it's really a challenge of your own creativity.
Well, and it's much freer even than playing a standard, a jazz standard, and improvising over that, because there's a form, there's a melody, there's a chord structure, but conduction has none of that.
No, it really is. The music can go anywhere. And then as Butch started to bring in more classical players, because he really wanted to broaden the palette of instruments. And I've experienced this too, and I experienced it with Sam Rhodes, who is this incredible classical bassoonist, is you get comments like, I'm not an improviser, can you just tell me what you want me to play? And it's fascinating. So you get this kind of fear in a way.
Well, or what you were talking about while we were listening to the music, which was sort of this sort of unhealthy relationship that an orchestral musician has with their conductor. It's kind of this tug of war that he was expecting to encounter, but somehow didn't.
Yeah, no, when Sam first joined the band, I was convinced that he was going to fire himself in the first few months, because there was this real kind of thing about the conductor. So he was always kind of like challenging me in a certain way, but I wasn't giving him the response that he was expecting. And it took him a while, but he finally realized that he now had permission to actually exhibit a talent that was far beyond what was being used in the orchestras that he played in. I mean, he was an amazing bassoonist. He was played the soprano saxophone like no one I've ever heard before. He also surprised the entire ensemble one day and started doing some harmonic overtone singing that just completely floored the whole ensemble, and everyone basically said, "Where have you been keeping this?" But it took him a long time to feel comfortable enough, safe enough to actually show how much he actually had.
Well, Dino's going to be conductioning. Is that what's the right word? You're not conducting it. You're leading. Can I say leading?
I'm acting as the. Basically, conduction is this: the musicians are responsible for the content I'm responsible for the structure.
Okay, which is a lot of words to describe the guy standing in front of the band, but that's where Dino's going to be. Dino, I was going to ask you about the next piece here. Now, this is also in New Mexico. This is 2004. I want to talk a little bit about the next work there.
Yes, I think we're going to do two back-to-back.
Oh, okay. So we'll do Circle 5 and Fondue?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think the real composition in a conduction is your choice of instruments. And it isn't just your choice of instruments, it's your choice of players.
Well, and your choice of cheeses.
And cheeses, yes. So we're going to play two examples. I was invited to do a conduction at a percussion event. So I put together an ensemble of 6 percussionists, and I taught them the vocabulary. And so we're going to hear a cut from a concert we did. And then I was working with Theater Grotesco on a piece called Pi, which is, we're actually touring now. And we did a workshop for actors and spoken word artists and poets. And we had about 18 or 20 people show up for this workshop, this 2-day workshop. And at the time we were working on Pi, and they were using this text that they called the cheese madrigal, which was just this list of exotic cheeses.
And Dino brought the list with him to the studio this evening.
And so we used it. The thing with when you're working with text people is some of them are really good at it, but the majority of text people don't have a working history of improvising text, the way that musicians have more of a history improvising music.
Well, can you give an example of, like, how do you improvise text?
Well, like, slam poetry, a lot of that is improvised, freestyle rap. But there isn't as long a history, and it isn't as common a thing. And like freestyle rap is very stylistic. So when working with spoken word, it's always good to bring some kind of text. But in the conduction situation, in a workshop, I'm more interested in the rhythm of words than I am a linear story. So we're going to play two things. One is the percussion sextet, and then we're going to play the FONDU choir, which is all these voices only working with a list of cheeses.
All right, let's listen to that, and then when we're done, we'll talk more a little bit about what we had just heard. This is Conduction, conducted by J.A. Deane, Circle number 5, followed by FONDU choir. Two examples of conduction there. We just heard the FONDU choir, and yes, that was a list of cheeses they were reciting. And then before that, a piece entitled Circle Number 5 from the 2004 Santa Fe New Music Festival. The drum is the voice of the trees, and conducted by my guest this evening, Dino J.A. Deane. Dino, did you want to talk about FONDU choir at all, or are we?
Well,
did the cheese speak for itself?
I think the cheese spoke for itself. But it's just fascinating that every word you heard was drawn from this list of cheeses.
What was that one? Timberlake Snickerdoodle?
Timberdoodle, Gorgonzola, Stinking Bishop, Limburger, Ticklemore, Vacheron, Drunken Hooligan.
I think you made some of those up. Those are all real cheeses.
Aged Edam.
Well, that one I know, yeah.
But it's fascinating to me just what happens with when text becomes more about rhythm than actually telling a story. You know, it's I just find the rhythm of text just a fascinating thing.
Well, and I think it's a good example of what you were saying earlier, which is really, it's not the genre, it's not the ensemble. You can lay this type of improvisatory technique on any ensemble.
Well, that's one of the things, you know, I think conduction was Butch's thing the whole time he was alive, and he did over 200 numbered conductions all around the planet with an unbelievable number of musicians that he taught to do this. And he was very specific that he didn't want to limit this method to stylistic category. And as you've heard tonight, you put it with different instruments, and each member of the ensemble is being responsible for the content that they're playing, and not in terms of, wow, what a cool solo I just played, but the content and how it is supporting everything else in the ensemble. So if, like I've worked with a standard big band format, and it sounds like big band music. I've worked with poets, everybody bringing their own poem into it. The biggest problem with poets is when you cut them off, getting them to, if you cut them off before their sentence is done.
There's a joke in there somewhere.
Oh yeah.
And we're going to get back to that, but I do want to stay legal here. You're listening to KGNU, Boulder, Denver, and Fort Collins. We're 3 minutes after 11 o'clock. You're right in the middle of our Monday evening avant-garde and contemporary classical music program entitled The Present Edge. This is Gary McBride, and my guest in the studio this evening is the leader of what's called Flux Crew. It's a conduction ensemble. And, I can't read that. I've got it bigger here. We've got, Dino wants me to list the members of the Flux Crew. But before I do, I want to say that you can hear this being created in front of you without a script, without notes, without a plan. And the result is through composed music. Dino, we were just talking during that last drumming piece, and he said that a composer, a classical composer, came up to him afterwards and said, you did in 10 minutes what it would have taken me 6 months to be able to compose. And it really does have that sort of complete composed feeling to it. But you can hear the Flux Crew in concert Friday, November 16th at 8 p.m. here in Boulder, 13th and Pine at the Pine Street Church. There will be an admission fee, but you can get a good deal if you sign up at Eventbrite ahead of time. And here is the list. And I hope I don't mangle the names, but the conductor, it says conductor on here. Dino J.A. Deane. Don't call him conductor. He's just the guy who stands up in front of the group and waves his arms around. Alvaro Saldana, flute. Bruce Orr, bassoon. Mark Harris, alto sax and flute. Paul Mimlich, bass clarinet. Brian Mullins on zongu. Gil Sellinger is the cellos. Actually, there are 3 cellists. Gil, Katie Harlow, and Phil Norman. The inestimable Matthew Paulson is on contrabass. Joseph Sabella on vibes. Victoria Lundy on theremin. Todd Billsborough on guitar. Farrell Lowe, who many of you in Boulder know, is on guitar. Evan Mazunik, keyboard, also very popular around. In fact, this is just an all-star group. And then Nina Roll is going to be vocalizing. How is Nina going to be vocalizing? Will she have a script or cards or something to be working from?
She's going to. Nina is a very interesting. She's a voiceover artist, so she does a lot of voice work, and so I'm bringing a collection of random texts that she's going to work with, and then we're also using one chapter from the book called Autumn for one particular section of the piece that should be rather interesting.
Was that the same book that was just published last year and
Yes.
was on the Man Booker shortlist?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
okay.
And there's one chapter that was written about Brexit, but we've removed the lines that make it specific to England, and it is a pretty fascinating portrait of our country right now. And so we're going to use that text in one section of the evening. I don't know where or how, but
and neither does she.
And neither does she. But we are going to use that.
All right. Do you want to talk about the next piece? It's called Zen Noir.
Yes.
Or is that the ensemble name?
The ensemble is Zen Noir. I was doing a number of workshops, and for 2 years, I had played at this remix festival in Kristiansand, Norway, called the Punkt Festival, where they have performances in a theater, and then down in another theater, they have all of the individual lines from the musicians going down to another theater where people are live sampling that, and then after that concert is done, people then go downstairs to the other theater and hear an immediate remix of what they just heard.
Okay. Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, it's called the Punkt Festival, and I played there I think 3 times now, and they have an educational outreach program associated with that festival. So for 2 years, they brought me in to work with students at the local college, and then teaching them conduction, and then they would play the opening night of the festival. And for many of them, it was one of their first experiences playing a festival, and this is an international festival. And so the first year, it was a voluntary thing. Anybody who wanted to do it could sign up. Well, the second year, they gave me the entire freshman class. They made it a mandatory thing.
That's dangerous.
So I walked in to this ensemble that was, and this is for real, I'm not making this up. I had 4 drummers. I had 4 electric bass players. I had 2 piano players, 2 organ players, a wind quintet, a string quintet, 11 opera singers, and 7 electric guitar players.
You had me at 11 opera singers.
and I was like, I saw the list, and I was like, wow, you couldn't make this up, you know? And one of the things that happened that was really fascinating was I told all the guitar players that since we had so many chordal instruments, we had so many melodic instruments, that I wanted them to really explore the more sculptural aspects of the electric guitar. And I asked them to bring really small amps and bring all their effects pedals and use feedback. And there's a sign that means harmonics that we slightly altered for the guitar players to mean feedback. And I treated the guitar players like another choir. So I had a vocal choir, and they were all 11 vocalists were on a raised section in the back. I had a drum and bass duo in each corner, so I separated them so the drummers would have to listen across the room. And I had the 7 electric guitar players as a choir right in front of the vocalists. And some of the things that happened with the electric guitars and the feedback was just amazing. And so for 1 year after Out of Context had come to an end, I did an electric guitar choir for a year. And it was in New Mexico. It was the last thing I did before I moved here. And it was and I wanted something that everything came out of speakers. I didn't want any acoustic instruments. So I had 2 percussionists, Joseph Sabella and Milton Villarrubia, who are both amazing drummers, but they both played electronic percussion. So everything came out of speakers. And then I had 6 electric guitar players, Jeremy Blake, Sean Buckley, Ross Hamlin, Alex Neville, Carlos Santesteban, and Doug Wooldridge. And we played together for just a year, played 1 concert, and did this recording called Zen Noir. And so this piece called Shadow Forms is, the whole thing is the sign harmonics and feedback.
All right. Well, let's listen to that. And before we do, I'd like to thank my guest this evening, Dino J.A. Deane, who leads the Flux Crew and will be leading the Flux Crew at the Pine Street Church, 13th and Pine in Boulder, November 16th at 8 p.m. Get your tickets on Eventbrite. Dino, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Can you believe that was all guitar feedback? That was an example of conduction. The ensemble was called Zen Noir. The piece was called Shadow Forms, and I'd like to give a shout out once again to Dino J.A. Deane, who is leading his conduction crew entitled the Flux Crew. They're going to be performing in Boulder on the evening of Friday, November 16th. So thanks once again to Dino for taking time out of his schedule to stop by the lovely KGNU studios here in Boulder. Let's continue with the present edge. Gary McBride here. I'll be with you until the midnight hour. I thought next we'd listen to a piece for string quartet and clarinet. This is music by Osvaldo Golijov. We're going to hear the Kronos Quartet. The piece is entitled The Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind.